Hello, everybody, and welcome to an episode of Beyond Talking Points. This is episode 21, and it's Matt with my co-host Matthew. And today we're going to talk about the debate at the Soho Forum. So the Soho Forum is sponsored by Reason Magazine. They host a debate. It seems like about every month. It's owned by Gene Epstein, who actually takes part in this debate. And we both watched it and had some thoughts on it. This debate occurred in September of last year, I believe, and I watched it at the time, but I thought it would be interesting to revisit. I should have probably written down the literal thing that they're debating, but I guess that's not as interesting because we're gonna more riff off, as we typically do, the thoughts of the people debating. So maybe the literal proposition they were debating might not be as important, but it was essentially Gene Epstein taking the side of capitalism and Dr. Richard Wolff taking the side of socialism. And the premise was something of the sort of which philosophy is better for freedom, equality, and the third word is escaping me. But it was an interesting debate. I'm very familiar with both their work. They talk about Richard Wolff's book from 2012 quite a bit, and I'd read that or listened to that sometime last year. So we're going to just kind of go through some notes that we made and go back and forth on things that jumped out to us. Because it definitely wasn't the typical capitalist versus socialist debate. And it talks about a lot of stuff that we haven't touched on this show, even though we've essentially done 20 episodes that mostly dance around this question. So let's jump into it and let's start going down your list of notes. And you can add more context to the debate if you wanted to add anything else.
Thank you. I would say both men, Gene Epstein and Richard Wolff, were good exponents of, or good. They're both good at public speaking. They both are obviously very intelligent and they have powerful arguments. So, I watching this debate made me think about like each of the points they were making was like basically what you and I are trying to do in these podcasts, but just they do it much better. So that was an interesting little parallel that kind of came to my mind. But just to get start going down my list of notes, Richard Wolff begins his opening statement is first, and he starts going into the fact that there was a time when Marxists and socialists and communists were a respectable. They were part of respectable society, and he talks about how it was thanks to their activism that FDR FDR passed a lot of the legislation that we have come to know him for. And then Richard Wolff says around the time of 1945 is when people started to view socialism, capitalism, Marxism, all those ideas as bad. And he talks about how at some level people are afraid to teach Marxism because Wolff, I think he went to Ivy League schools, but he said that, and he was an econ major, but he said that his teachers either knew nothing about Marxism or were afraid to teach Marxism. And so Richard Wolff is sort of trying to bring those topics into light and wants to actually think about what Marx had to say, looking at the various experiments, socialist experiments that happened in history. And I couldn't agree with him more. I think we need to have these conversations, even if we assume that Marxism is completely wrong or socialism or communism, even if we assume that all those ideologies are just completely false, there's nothing there. We still have to look into it. I mean, how do we know if something's wrong unless we've researched it and read it and talked to people about it? So I respect Richard Wolff for his role as an educator.
Yes, so there was a couple things that are that in that part of his intro statement kind of jump out to me for better and worse. So when he talks about the history of it, I recently I sat down and I listened to the episode we did on anarchism. And at one point, you asked me a question, and you prefaced it by mentioning that FDR is your favorite president or one of your favorites. And I made the joke that you all said that almost like you didn't want me to hear the question and you wanted me to be triggered. But one of the reasons I say that is because as a person who is not a big fan of the state, obviously when I was closer to a right-wing person, I was very interested in understanding more about FDR's legacy because he struck me as, almost a king in terms of how much he expanded the government. So I was very interested in alternate. I guess the way to describe it is there's when you look at most historical events, there is a narrative that is shaped, but I don't think the narrative is always true. And I think FDR gets a lot more credit than he deserves because he's done a lot of things that were really bad for the economy and for the country. So one thing that Richard Wolff did is he talks a lot about that legacy and how important these people on the far left that are ostracized today were to FDR. Ended up if that coalition didn't exist, FDR might not have done these radical policies. But I would probably push back and say, well, I don't think these policies are good, and I think there's reasons to think they actually made the country worse at the time. So I think that's a point that I'd want to make. Now, and unrelated to the historical part, when he talked about how it was hard for him to learn about Karl Marx's theories in school, I kind of had I reacted kind of weird to this. It's almost like the way that if you're listening to I think the appropriate derogatory term is a boomer con. The boomer cons that kind of complain about like all these same issues on the right-wing side where they feel like they're being silenced in schools and academia. Well, one of the things that rubs me the wrong way when I hear their complaints is it's because a lot of times it's like, well, when would these people be exposed to these ideas and why? Now, I had to read the Communist Manifesto in college, but I read it in a humanities class, and I was an economics major. So you could be thinking, well, Matt, you're an economics major. Karl Marx considers himself as a person working in the, economics, in that sphere. So why wasn't I exposed to his work in my classes? And I think that there's some genuine reasoning on why I wouldn't be exposed to that, other than because people are afraid of Marx's ideas. And I kind of didn't like how Richard Wolff jumped to that conclusion. Because if you look at the world that we live in, you can criticize it for being, capitalist or neoliberal. But because it is capitalist and neoliberal, they're only going to teach students those philosophies because that's what is relevant in the workplace, in the business world, and in our country. And unless you're trying to teach people to be political activists to upend the system, then nobody needs to learn about Marx if they're actually going to work in the field today. And I'm not saying his work isn't valuable, and I'm not saying there isn't reason to study him. But I'm saying if you're training economic students in economics to go get a job in the United States modern economic systems, then we already have this neoliberal framework. And if you're prepping somebody to work in it, then why would you teach them abstract things about some Marxist work? Especially given how little you can really teach in a 3 or 4 year degree. It doesn't necessarily mean people are afraid of it. Now, I do wish I learned more about it because I feel like that's a weak spot, and I wish I understood a lot more of their thinking so I could give them a better, I can give the devil their due when I address their points. But I don't really think it would help me in my life if I'd been exposed to that in college. And that kind of gets to what's the point of college? Is college about learning esoteric ideas that might not be relevant in our society right now? Or at least in our political, system. So yeah, I think it's much more broad than people are afraid to teach it, and that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But you can say something on that. It just struck me as like, oh yeah, it's when boomer cons complain about how left-wing activists never hear what right-wing people think. I was just like, yeah, you're exaggerating that the idea is dangerous when it might just be because they're in college for a different reason.
I think actually we should at this point touch on the 3 main points that Richard Wolff made. I could quickly go down them right now, or we could go down them one by one either way. But I wanted to add one quick thought, which is I disagree with the statement that it's not important to read Karl Marx. I mean, again, even if we assume that he was wrong about everything, and he was definitely wrong about some things, but even if we assume he was just a nutcase, he, you bring up the point that, there's truth in everything. I think you say something like that. You can learn a lot from Karl Marx, and I think many people have, even who radically disagree with him. I mean, the way he understood capitalism, again, whether you agree with the idea that you need to get rid of capitalism or not, he understood it to a degree that many people before and since have never understood it. I mean, there are people, there are hedge fund managers and billionaires that will tell you, hey, just look at what Marx said. He really understood what's going on, even though they completely disagree with the idea that we need a socialist revolution. So that would be my caveat to that.
Oh no, I agree with that completely. I wasn't saying you should ignore him. I'm just saying in the context of I'm getting a college degree to do X, like to work in the economics field, to actually have a job in the economics field, there's no reason why reading Marx would be a prereq to doing these generic jobs that you just need a 4-year degree for. So although I do see value in it, I'm just saying, like, I think there's a reason other than Marx is dangerous to why I didn't have to take an intro to Marx class when they want to teach econometrics to me, because econometrics is more relevant in terms of getting a job in the field. That was more my point. So it's like, I totally agree there's value to at least hearing him out and maybe taking the hint of truth out of it, or at least seeing what he has to say and knowing his arguments for if you disagree, because it will strengthen yours. I just don't necessarily think it's because he's dangerous, he's being hidden from people. And that's kind of Wolff's implication. I think there are practical reasons why I only encountered Marx in a humanities class and not my economics classes. I think that's all I was trying to get across. But yeah, we should go through those 3 flaws of capitalism, as Wolff says. And I think I'd want to go one by one, because I think there's kind of at least a little bit for each one that I don't want to unpack, and I don't want to lose track. So do you want to lead us off that?
Yeah. So the first main point that Wolff makes in his opening is that capitalism is unstable. And I'll just give a brief little background, or I'll give a little background. So what does he mean by that? He brings up the fact that every 5 to 7 years there's a crisis that goes on, and he calls that the business cycle. So basically, Wolff is saying that you can't that there are failures built into capitalism that are not, in the long run, you won't be able to get the kind of growth and the kind of prosperity and the kind of freedom that you want because of the business cycle that inherently goes on.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that is a good summary of his kind of points, or his point on stability. And I do want to track that back to another example from the episode we did on anarcho-capitalism and how I think it relates. Very early on in that discussion, you defined anarcho-capitalism for me and kind of asked me if I agreed with that definition. And one thing that I noticed about this debate is Richard Wolff doesn't really like, he doesn't really treat the flavors of capitalism differently. So, and I think that this is kind of a point that we had butted on in the past. And I think by me defining that I support anarcho-capitalism, it lets me kind of hand wave a lot of problems with state capitalism, because it's like, obviously I'm not in favor of the state interfering. So state capitalism's problems aren't really issues that I see as a problem with my ideals. So one of the things that he talks about is the issue with the business cycle. And one of the reasons why the economy crashes pretty much every handful of years is because of the misallocation of resources, right? We have an artificially low interest rate. And then because the interest rate is really low, companies are able to borrow money at a very cheap rate. But if the rate was higher, those companies wouldn't be sustainable. These are companies that are breaking even because of these artificially low rates. But then the second those rates aren't being held down anymore, and then they increase, or because the Fed lets them increase or something like this, all of a sudden all these companies are in danger because they need these stupidly low rates to be able to thrive or survive. So these companies would not survive in a environment where they weren't essentially being subsidized by rates that are too low. So then a bunch of companies crash, and then all the companies that are teetering on edge all of a sudden start dying at the same time. Nobody trusts these companies, and that's when you get a recession every handful of years. That's a very overly simplified version, and there usually is a chain reaction that occurs, but a lot of it is because of these interventions that change the status quo circumstances. I think a lot of that is the result of state capitalism and the government having control over the money supply and the government controlling interest rates through central banking. So I don't really think that instability would necessarily be there in terms of anarcho-capitalism. You wouldn't necessarily have these things interlinked in a certain way that the state kind of has created. So I think this is a bigger issue with state capitalism, and I agree with Richard Wolff that that's terrible. But if the government wasn't devaluing our currency year over year, people wouldn't be heavily leveraged with their own life savings and 401ks in these financial markets anyways. So if the economy dips 25%, it wouldn't really matter because you wouldn't necessarily be investing all your money in there because your money wouldn't lose value year over year no matter what. So I guess a lot of what I'm saying here is the issue he's pointing out, I think, is a problem with state capitalism. And I don't really feel like it's attacking me. And I think I agree with him. Yeah, these crashes are terrible, but I think they're the result of intervention.
Well, I guess I'll just say I think you put too much emphasis on the state. I think what an anarcho-cap. Yeah, I mean you laid out your position very well. But I think. I mean, just to make a minor historical point, so far, at least in human history, there really hasn't been a capitalism without the state. The state has always intervened in capitalism at one point or another. But I guess the question for me, or the concern for me, is I'm not yet convinced that a stateless capitalist society can account for all the externalities that we can either predict or not predict. So I don't. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah. So okay. So I agree to some extent that a lot of the things that I was pointing out, it's hard to trace them back to an example where, because a state has existed in most civilizations, because a state's natural, right? It's natural to want to centralize power. Now, with that said, I think a lot of crises that have occurred, you can generally, usually they're caused by chains of events, and you can find the point where something was subsidized, a choice was made, and a certain goal was championed by the state. And like for example, the most recent 2008 crash, what set that off was, the housing bubble. Well, the housing bubble, we have a Department of Housing and Development in our country because we have this idea that Americans should own homes. So a lot of people who get loans aren't just getting loans from a bank. They're getting loans that are subsidized by the government, backed by the government, or they're given incentives by the government to give people loans that are at a lower rate than they really should be. So then what happens is, once a bunch of people in a certain sector lose their jobs, all those people who have had these loans given to them where they probably shouldn't have gotten a loan because they were more at risk, but the government has subsidized it, all of them start defaulting on their houses. Then, because people had been under the exception the government would bail them out because they've told them to do this, then the chains just everything starts falling because this was relying on this, and then all of it's, based on the idea that they're going to get bailed out anyways because they're doing something the government wanted. So although you could say, well, I'm not convinced because we haven't seen a lot from a certain society, I think a lot of the biggest bubbles you can trace back to governments setting up bad incentives. That's why I'm very confident in that position. Yeah, and there is I think that covers that point fine, and I won't go down another tangent because I think we'll touch on it later anyways. So I think we're good.
Alrighty, we'll move on to the next part then, or next point, which I have a little more to say. The next 2 points I have a little more to say than the stability or instability of capitalism. So Richard Wolff says capitalism is unequal, and he gives the numbers that the 80 or 90 richest people in the world have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. And remember that bottom half of the population is 3.5 billion people. And of course, I that is one reason I am very critical of capitalism, and that's one reason I have not yet gotten on board with anarcho-capitalism. I think, and I think actually you and I agree on this, maybe for different reasons, but we can both recognize the weird situation you have when a certain group of people has an enormous amount of wealth, and the other group of people, or a majority, gets peanuts. And of course, I think I've said this before, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's relevant. A capitalist. What is a capitalist trying to do? A capitalist is trying. Most people would answer you, "Oh, they're trying to make a profit," but that's not quite accurate. They're trying to make as much of a profit as possible. Otherwise, if one company, has or earns a couple million, $2 million, and your competitor earns $2.5 million, you're the one who earns the $2 million is the loser. You will be outcompeted by the company that earned $2.5 million. So it's kind of built into capitalism that capitalists will try to get more and more, get as much wealth as possible. So this income inequality that we see is actually, it shows that at some level capitalism is doing its job. But that doesn't allow for the majority of people to thrive. It allows a certain amount of people to thrive extremely well. And now, I guess I would end with, generally speaking, capitalism has produced a greater a standard of living for most people. Not everybody. There are some people who, fall through the cracks, but generally speaking, you and I have a very good standard of wealth due to capitalism. But I don't think that's going to continue. And I think the example of the third world countries illustrates that probably where the symbiosis of capitalism and high standards of living is not going to hold up in the near future.
So I think I have to revert back to my BoomerCon self from a few years ago to make a point that I always reluctantly make, and I made on the show before. It's like one of the weird talking points that makes me remember how I was right wing to some extent at one point in my life, and it's because there are certain talking points they'll say that like obviously ring true to me now, but there are some things that I very much identify with the hints of truth that they're saying, and one of them is inequality is not necessarily bad. Because the real issue is poverty. The fact that you and I have unequal living standards, and even if there was a huge gap, as long as we were living a quality life, it doesn't really matter if mine is, if I'm so much more wealthy than you, as long as we're up to a certain level. The real issue is that there's a large amount of people at the bottom, usually in third world countries, right? So I don't think I have anything to complain about income inequality, because the fact that Bill Gates exists and makes, some huge factor more than I make, like that's literally true, but it doesn't make my life really any worse because I meet a certain standard of living. So I don't necessarily think the income inequality itself is the actual issue. I think the issue is more that some people are impoverished. And then I think that's kind of a separate thing to tackle. I'm also not really convinced that maximizing your profit is an inherently bad thing in any capacity. Because usually when you're profiting, well, how should I state this? The profit maximization equation that a lot of companies would do to determine like how much of a good to produce and at what price generally ends up helping a large amount of people. They aren't just trying to sell one PS4, right? The profit maximizing thing for Sony is to make a ton of them anyways and sell them at a reasonably affordable price, even if they're making a certain margin off of them. So I don't necessarily find maximizing profit as something that's to be frowned upon. Yeah, and I guess the last small point I would make on this is just equality. I don't even think is an honorable ends because people put in different inputs, right? So if two people work at the same company and one is trying significantly harder and he is much more productive and so forth, I just don't see why they should be rewarded, I guess, in the same way as somebody else. So I don't think equality is necessarily a good goal. And I haven't been really convinced on it. Now, so what I really think the correct, I guess, flaw should be poverty and not inequality. And if we wanted to address that, we could. But I think that's almost a completely separate issue that he doesn't really touch on. And yeah.
I guess we can probably tie some of this back into a later part of the podcast. I guess I'll just keep going down my list of topics. The other main point he makes is capitalism is fundamentally undemocratic. Now, I know you're not a fan of democracy, so it'll be interesting to hear your take on this. But I consider myself very democratic, small d democratic. And you know, Richard Wolff brings up the fact that, and I brought this up in the podcast as well, that historically speaking, society's gotten more and more democratic. So, you know, I think if I remember correctly, the sort of the Marxist way of viewing the development of civilization, you know, it started with primitive man, and then I think it went on to having a slave economy. Then it had feudalism. Then there was capitalism, and I guess, and Marx would say after that socialism, after that is communism. But the point being, I guess you could say there's been a gradual enfranchisement of more and more people, and that is fun. I think it's very hard to argue that is fundamentally a regression. It's a form of progress, because it takes it takes the fact that every individual, every human being has certain value and has the right to that every human being deserves a chance to live the best version of them, be the best version of themselves, and live the best life they can lead. And you know, the problem with capitalism is, again, I don't think historically it has been the case that generally has worked, but I don't think we're trending that way. Yeah.
Okay. I have a couple very different off-the-wall thoughts on this. So we might want to address them one at a time, or at least I'll say one, and then I'll let you see if you have a response on it. Because you do know I have unorthodox views on democracy, but that's because we're normally talking about political democracy, and that's actually not something I have a lot to say on, because I think I've kind of done my diatribe on that enough, and you're very familiar with my point. So I kind of appreciate that you just gave your rundown. But I guess I don't think it's. I think it's almost off topic to say my response to that, which is really about the non-aggression principle, right? That's why I object to political democracy, because I don't think I necessarily consented, blah blah blah. We don't need to do that right now. So I have two thoughts, and your mileage may vary with them. I guess the shorter one that I'll start with is about prices in a market, and it's just I've been coming back to this idea since you used to quote a few episodes back about how anarchy is the purest form of democracy, and some person, I think an environmentalist or something like that, had stated that, and I think that's an interesting thought. I don't know if it's the way they intended for it to mean, but it's kind of this idea that the actual market that decides prices based off supply, demand, and consent is almost the most pure form of democracy, like just the thing that people say about voting with your wallet, right? Because if nobody decides to go and buy a certain product, that product's not going to be produced anymore if they can't get it off the shelves. So this is everybody kind of citing their preferences with their pay, and that determines a lot of what is created in our world and what isn't. That's why we see companies go over. A lot of entertainment, a lot of media, a lot of TV shows get canceled because nobody watches. People have these ways to show their preferences, and I think it's very democratized. And that's how we pretty much decide what the goods are in our system, right? I wouldn't have sunflower seeds to buy at the store if a bunch of other people didn't also like eating sunflower seeds and then going and buying them. So in a way, that is voting by showing your preferences. So I guess I wanted to open that up to you and see if you have any thoughts on how that interacts with, because I think the actual open market is to some extent one of the main essences of capitalism, and being able to buy what you want with your money. And I kind of think that, I guess what I'm saying is that's inherently democratic. Now I'll talk about more of the corporate system after. That's my other point. But do you have any thoughts on, I guess, what I'm saying about pricing and goods and production?
Well, I'm reminded of, I think it was in the Q&A that Richard Wolff said, the issue is not with markets. He said feudalism had a market. He said the slave economy had a market. His issue is with the relationship between those who own production, the means of production, and those who work for those who own the means of reproduction. So in other words, Richard Wolff's issue is with employers and employees. Now, another thing that comes to my mind, you brought up Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the ideas that he wanted to work on, which he never quite succeeded at this, but he believed, he looked at the Bill of Rights we have, a political Bill of Rights. You can't, or generally speaking, you have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. But according to FDR, we needed an economic Bill of Rights. Roosevelt thought that we needed to a certain extent, make sure that everyone is okay materially, and has a roof over the head, has a food to eat and whatnot. And of course, Richard Wolff would say, would go a step farther and would say we need to completely democratize the economy. And that's a very good way of putting it, because to kind of tie it somewhat back to the last point we just made, I think we should live in a society in which people have control over their lives, and that includes giving people more control in the economy, which at this point we don't really have.
Well, the point I was trying to make is in terms of the aggregation of people's buying preferences is essentially democratized. So everything that comes out to what is produced by companies and what is bought by people is, I think, inherently democratized. And I know, I guess that's not really relevant to Richard's point, and I guess it would only be relevant towards people who typically find themselves against markets and thinking markets are unfair, and saying profits in themselves are unfair and not the distribution of profits. But I guess what I'm saying is profits are democratic in the terms of people buy things based on what they want. The aggregate determines, what ends up being supplied. Maximizing those profits isn't unfair. And then that leaves, I haven't addressed how those profits are divided, sure. But I guess what I'm saying is if somebody was saying they were against markets because they're not fair, I feel like pointing out that prices are an aggregate of what people want should, I think that should be a point that doesn't go without acknowledgement. And I know you don't necessarily have that stance. I know Richard Wolff clearly doesn't care about that issue. I guess I just wanted to bring it up because it felt relevant.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add, to directly answer your question, I think that's a fair point, and I think you're actually right. But what I would say, and probably what Richard Wolff would say, is we need to further democratize the market. So generally speaking, the market has led the market does lead to a certain amount of democracy, and so is capitalism. But we need to we need to go to the logical conclusion of that democratization, in my view.
Okay, and I'm glad you said that, because that leads into my other response when it comes to capitalism being undemocratic. Because I actually like how you just phrased that. I don't know if you'll want to stand by it at the end of my point. But I think maybe that is where the logical conclusion actually is. Maybe it should end with that being the point of it. Because so where I believe in capitalism in terms of being a worker should be democratic is I give you the autonomy to consent to how you would like to use your labor. Like, you don't have to work for a certain company. You have your pick of what company to work for, because plenty will extend you offers if you're a skilled person. And you don't necessarily have to stay in a certain region. You could really go anywhere in our country and try to find an employer that you want to work for whatever reasons you want, right? So you get to contract out your own labor to the employer that you desire if they're willing to offer you a job. I think that's pretty democratic. Now, one thing that I found interesting about, I guess, his idea of workers owning the companies they work for is, so I work at a company that is huge. It is a huge, I guess I won't mention how it's international, because I guess I would only muddy the situation more. So imagine it was a national company. But if it was a democracy, I think I would be a very useless owner in my company, because my company does so much beyond my role that I don't really understand what choices the company should make. Because if you imagine a lot of large companies, they have several divisions that do completely different things. So then you might say, okay, Matt, well, what line of work do you work in? You should be able to vote on those things. And it's like, well, the thing is, among that line of work, we have dozens of clients. I only work on 2 of them. Well, okay, Matt, you should maybe be able to make decisions within your clients. Okay, well, I only work on one of the 3 teams. I only work on the calculations team. I'm not on these other 2 teams that go onto those clients. So I can't really make decisions about them. And then it's like, and then if we take it down even more, it's like, okay, well, now we're in a group of 8 people that could make decisions, but some people work on bigger picture things within the team, and I work on very small manual things. So maybe I'm okay with this, almost like an aristocracy that ends up naturally developing from the segmented line of work I work in. I kind of am okay with there being a team leader who makes the big picture decisions for our team, and then a line of business leader that ends up making these decisions. And then, although they're not the only ruler, they're probably consulting several people to make every decision. It's pretty much a republic, or aristocratic in nature. And it's good that I don't have a say, because I don't know anything. And if I did have to learn all these other things about all the other lines of businesses to contribute to help make decisions, it'd probably be bad for me. It'd probably be very inefficient. So I guess what I'm saying is, I can imagine a scenario where democratizing a company works, but very real companies that exist that are, any size bigger than 50 to 100 employees, I can't really imagine why being a democracy would be that effective. Now, I need to continue I need to bring up a few more examples. In the very first episode of the show, which I almost alluded to earlier for other reasons, we covered a bit on Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio, he works at Bridgewater Capital, I'm pretty sure. He has a book called Principles, and it's his life principles in terms of how he's worked in his company. And one thing he does is he to some extent democratizes his workplace, but it's almost like a weighted vote. So pretty much everybody would have this assigned score that is, so everybody had a vote, but it would be weighted based on past success of like things you've done, and then past things, success that you've like voted for. And then you would vote on things based on that. So it's not a pure democracy, because people's votes aren't equal, but to some extent it's democratized. So I guess what I'm saying is it's hard to imagine how democratized a democratized company should be. And some people, as I think Gene Epstein kind of made the point a lot in the debate, a lot of people don't really want to have a voice in their company on a big picture because they aren't necessarily have all the information and don't want to be in a position to do that. I think I have a couple more criticisms when it comes to democratizing it, but I think that's enough that you probably want to respond. So I'll stop there for now.
Okay, so there are kind of two major points. And the first one, it's hard. Like I want to phrase it. I don't want to phrase it in an antagonistic way. I take your arguments. I don't think you are allowing for, or I don't think you're acknowledging that the potential that a lot of people have. So, you know, I'm kind of a similar point was brought up in to Noam Chomsky, and he, said to the guy, well, you're basically advocating slavery. And I'm not trying to be that flippant about it, but, I don't think, I don't see how, you can bring me examples of, well, this company wouldn't work democratically. You could say that. But of course we'd have to go, we'd have to really get into the nitty gritty of the examples and what does it mean to be running a company and what are all the various factors. But, I think there are many companies, many businesses that could be run democratically, and we need to, and I also have a problem, just like Richard Wolff, with the employers versus employees dichotomy that is that we live under, for various reasons that I've kind of already brought up. But if the hold on, I'm almost done. If the workers had more say so in their jobs, I think they would be far less, here's a Marxist buzzword, far less alienated from their line of work. They would be able to, if they almost had a share in the company in a sense, in a phrase, I think that would give people much more meaning in life, and I think that would lead to increased morale and productivity and all the rest of it. But the second point, that that Gene Epstein said, that, well, most people don't actually want to have a hand in, McDonald's or whatever. They just want to work, their 8-hour shift and then go home and watch Saturday Night Live. That they don't want to have to deal with the nitty gritty. So what I would say to that is, I think this kind of ties into another point. I was thinking about this because I guess one thing anyone listening to the show would notice, you're more, your worldview is more fleshed out than mine is at this point, at least. And listening to Richard Wolff kind of, it clicked for me why my worldview isn't as fleshed out as yours is, why my political philosophy is a bit more muddy than yours is. Because Richard Wolff said, well, I'm not proposing what socialism of the future is going to be. I'm looking at real world problems and I'm trying to operate on that level. So I guess what I'd say is, I think that's a valid argument to bring up. I think we don't want to have to, I think a lot of people don't want to have to live in a society where you have to, after going, an 8 or 12-hour day shift at your job, I got to go down to the town hall to debate politics, or I got to go to the meeting to allocate resources properly. And this so I think we have to, when we're constructing an alternative to capitalism, we have to allow for leisure time, and we have to allow for a certain amount of bureaucracy isn't exactly the right word, but we need certain institutions or systems in place which do allow people to tune out to a certain extent, because I think that is something that everyone should be able to do now and then.
Yes. So one of the reasons why I'm not, I guess, completely opposed to Richard Wolff is because I'm okay with his thought process when it doesn't resort to using the government as a weapon, right? That's a concession Gene Epstein regularly makes. So I guess what I'm trying to say is one of my big concerns is that if you combine his ideas with government, then you end up with a lot of situations I don't find particularly workable. Because I agree with you, there are companies that it could work for having it democratized, and you could essentially incentivize people better, and they could feel more involved and they could get more meaning out of it. But I also want to recognize that there are some people that they're okay with work being 8 hours of their life where they're renting themselves out for pay because they derive their meaning from completely other things outside of their work. Because I'm not going to pretend like I derive meaning from my job for 8 hours a day. But that doesn't mean I want a stake in my company's future. If I had a stake in my company's future, I feel like that would only make my life more stressful because I'd be worried about the outcomes because I'd probably be more tied to the outcomes. I'd probably have to do additional research outside of my scope of work already to try to make these big decisions that I don't know if I'm necessarily prepared to make or influence. So I guess one of my concerns isn't really that it would work in some and wouldn't work in others. It's if the state got involved in pushing this idea, then you would either be artificially making it easier and more financially okay. So one of the things Richard Wolff says is he pretty much says, well, the state needs to be there to lend money to the workers for the workers to take over a company. But then you're kind of saying, well, the state's going to give you a loan because the private sector won't. And if the private sector won't give you a loan, but the state will, then you're getting a loan at probably a discount of some sorts because the state is willing to give you a loan at a rate that doesn't properly assess the risk. And that's concerning because they're essentially giving a financial favor to a company just because it's doing something a certain way. But I think there's plenty of companies where it's not workable or the employees might be okay with the status quo. Now, I don't necessarily think the things you were saying were wrong because there are plenty of times where I could see it working, right? But it's hard for me to imagine it would be effective. And I don't necessarily want to spend an extra hour and a half of my day at work because now I have the responsibility of doing the work of a manager. So I give my opinion from being informed like a manager because I vote on it in that way. And that's just not something I'm interested in undertaking. I guess that's where that thought leads me. Now, I want to make it to reiterate my, my actual cultural worldview on this. And double down, I think, on the idea of I'm not a big fan of working for like the man, right? I don't necessarily like being a person who is just told what to do and I do it because I'm a good employee. I'm not a big fan of that. But I think there are avenues open to me as a person to get around that nowadays because there are more than ever opportunities to contract yourself out to your own clients that you find and work that you're skilled at without having to go through an organization. Now with the internet, you can find ways to make money in like numerous ways beyond the normal traditional sense. So I think there are ways to avoid this employer-employee relationship that people often despise just because of the technology in our hands. And you might not even need state intervention because all these people who really don't want to work in that relationship can find other ways to make money on their own as an entrepreneur. And I guess the last thing I just want to touch on is, and it's because I use the term, I need to touch on it. The employer-employee relationship is really muddy because I work on a team, but I have a team lead. To some extent, that team lead functions as my boss, but that person has a boss in the company, and that person has a boss within the company, and so forth. So it's kind of like, yes, this big organization is ruling me in a way, but it's also hard. I think this ties into why I criticize a lot of Marxist thought for saying the phrase the workers, because to some extent, my team lead is one of the workers because they're being ruled over, and so am I, but we're definitely not the same person. We definitely have different priorities. We're definitely at different skill levels. So I get concerned when we get put in the same group, especially the higher you go up in terms of people who are both employers and employees. So yeah, I agree, but you've made the concession that you want to be pragmatic about it, and that's obviously the goal. It's not necessarily an ideology. It gets muddy. I just have all these concerns when it gets put into practice that on any complex company, which companies are becoming increasingly complex, it's going to be hard to democratize it and not have like a locus of power. Yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that. So sorry if I kind of dragged on too long. I just wanted to get all that out there because that was my free form thinking while I was listening to the debate.
What I sort of want to transition topics here. And I wanted to touch on, so last podcast we kind of got bogged down because we have very different definitions of authoritarian. And I, at the risk of opening up, of the genie getting out of the bottle, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because I was really thinking about that question. What does it mean to be authoritarian? Can you be authoritarian in ways that maybe people generally don't see as authoritarian? And actually, Richard Wolff doesn't really answer. I think in the Q&A he was asked about that question himself, and he really didn't answer it. So I was somewhat disappointed in that. But okay, so what does it mean to be authoritarian? So, I would say that authoritarianism has to do with an overruling a state that is very involved in people's lives on multiple levels. Now, just to give a quick definition, if you Google, or authoritarianism is defined by Merriam-Webster as of relating to or favoring a concentration of power in a leader or an elite not constitutionally responsible to the people. So, the obvious examples, of course, are Stalin was an authoritarian and Hitler was an authoritarian, because not only, of course, did they not only did they control certain economic policies, but they also controlled the media. They controlled journalism. They put massive amounts of people to death who they disagreed with. And I guess I'm not sure, I'm not even sure the anarcho-capitalist framing of authoritarianism is very helpful. And because I guess here's a little thought experiment that I kind of had going on in my mind. Because I remember you saying, when I made the argument that, well, action or non-action is a form of action, you said, well, I don't really agree with that because, does that mean you're, you pay, does that mean, that you're, if you pay taxes, that you're, kind of putting force, you're kind of using force against me indirectly? Okay, so the little thought experiment I had was, I do pay my taxes. So probably at some point in my life, I don't know if it's happened yet, but probably at some point in my life, my tax money will go to fund the military. And the U.S. military is always involved in various missions and overseas in various countries. And so, if the U.S. military kills some innocent civilians, am I at all responsible? And so, at one level, of course, you'd say, well, no, not really, because you're not the one killing the innocent civilians. But on the other hand, you could say, well, you did give the government a certain amount of money, which may be a drop in the bucket, but it's still some money that was used to kill innocent civilians. So, I don't think, and Richard Wolff brings up another good point. He says it's kind of weird to him how when we have these debates about socialism versus capitalism, we start talking about body counts. We start talking about, well, socialism killed this amount of people, and isn't that awful? Therefore, socialism is bad. So I guess to sum up, I just, human relations are very tricky. We don't live in a black and white world. There really aren't good guys versus bad guys. There are just people acting in certain ways, and those actions have consequences. Sometimes they're perceived as good, sometimes they're perceived as bad. But, I think that no one is really innocent in that regard. So if we kind of take the if I accept your definition of authoritarian, I just don't think I don't think I'm innocent of that. I don't think you're innocent of that. I don't think anyone in human history has ever been innocent of that. So it almost depends on what kind of authority you're willing to put up with and what kind of authority you're willing to exert. I realize that might be a slightly blurry, abstract distinction, but that's kind of those are my thoughts about that little conversation we had last week.
Yeah, I'm open to the idea of relitigating that. I guess I do agree with what you said in the sense of you're not sure if the kind of framing I was using would be useful, right? And I don't necessarily think that's that wrong, because I was trying to make a nuanced point that is easy to turn off people because of the phrase or the way I'm choosing to frame it, which is somewhat intentional. So I found another definition of authoritarianism that is very similar to the Webster one. This is off Wikipedia, and I think it's a little more illustrative of my point, right? So their definition is authoritarianism is a form of government characterized by strong central power and limited political freedoms. So I think really what I'm saying is when I read that and I see limited political freedoms, I would say I would probably characterize the action of limiting political freedoms in a very, very, very broad way. So I think the existence of a state inherently is going to violate some political freedoms. So the existence of a state is inherently authoritarianism. Well, it's authoritarian in its character. I think that's endemic to it. Now, imagine a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is, Hitler levels of authoritarianism. It seems to me that, like, I'm pretty much saying anything on this scale is authoritarianism, and the most minuscule state possible is 1. And then what a lot of times you're arguing for is you're like, okay, well, I'm sitting here, I'm at a 25 on this scale, and everything I'm arguing for is for the better of what is probably better for people on average, at least based on my calculation of how I think events would play out. You're like, I'm okay with doing these things and redistributing things in this way, and these are all going to help more people than I think it will hurt, and I think this is very good. But I'm looking at it as, okay, but it's a state intervening. It's using its central authority to take some people's wealth, confiscate it, and give it to other people. This seems to me to be violating their freedom to some extent. This is definitionally authoritarian in nature, even if it's nowhere near any of the atrocities that we've encountered in human history. I still feel like the state doing these things is on this spectrum. Now, where I say I could see how that's not useful, because you're like, well, I think a state needs to exist, so you're just calling everything authoritarian. That's not helpful, Matt. Shut up. And it's like, okay, that's fair. That's fair. But the point I'm trying to make is even when you are doing things that are better for people with the state, I just try to reiterate, yeah, but remember, that's authoritarian because you're using a force that people have not consented to. And you are still, even if you think it's better for a lot of people, you're still confiscating some people's stuff. And they didn't necessarily consent to it, right? You're still doing something to somebody that was not voluntary in nature. If they wanted to avoid it, they would put themselves at risk of being thrown in a cage. So I just like to reiterate that that's going to be there no matter how benevolent you're trying to use the state. And I think that's an important thing to recognize because you are reaching into these people's lives and you're saying, hey, if you don't go along with my agenda, like, you're going to have to suffer the consequences of it. And even if I'm doing this for the good of everyone, it's like you're still a little bit on that authoritarian scale. You're obviously not near Hitler. I know that. I'm not trying to paint anybody like Hitler or any of those fascists, you know? But it's still like, if you're on that scale, I have reservations because I'm all about people freely interacting, people consenting to interactions. So I guess that's why I use that term so widely. And I think it's just because I'm stricter with part of the definition than the average person. Now, you can reject that or say it's not helpful. And I think that's very valid. And I'm okay with that. But I think that that's like the best way to spell out why I take that position.
Okay, so I guess there are two parts to my response. You know, in an essay, Christopher Hitchens said, history is more of a tragedy than it is a morality tale. And I only bring that up to say, you know, an example from English history, say, my ancestry is English, so I'm somewhat interested in English history. Oliver Cromwell is an interesting historical figure. You know, he's one of those figures that is completely divisive. You know, some people think, oh, he's a great hero. Others think, no, he was a villain and a tyrant, and they despise him. And you know, he was a very complex figure and a paradoxical figure, and he had many different. There were many sides to that man. But why do I bring him up? I bring him up because he accomplished one very important thing. And that very thing is he challenged autocratic rule. He challenged the idea that that mankind needs a king, because, you know, in some ways, if we had been born, I don't know, a couple hundred years ago, we might be having a very different conversation. You know, we might be, one of us might be saying, well, you know, the mass isn't fit to govern itself. We need a king to make these decisions, to run the economy. That's just the way it is. That's, you know, nothing's going to change. And so, you know, despite the fact that Oliver Cromwell wasn't a perfect figure, and even if he did terrible things, which he did, I think the fact that he challenged the concept of a king and of a monarchy was a net good. And, you know, I think most of the revolutions throughout history, not all of them perhaps, but quite a few of them, you know, such as the French Revolution or the American Revolution, you know, I think there was a net good to humanity. So I just don't think, again, as I said, no one's really innocent in this regard. So we just have to kind of figure out what moral gray area are we willing to live in? Because really that's all life is a series of gray areas. Usually there are occasional black and white situations, but most of the time it's a gray area, and we just kind of have to say, well, how gray, you know, are we willing to, how gray should our lives be, or what shade of gray are we going to accept in life? And then my other point, and I don't know if we want to really go down this rabbit hole or not, but I guess my, when I hear that definition from Wikipedia you gave, I zone in on and limited political freedoms, because I think one of my issues with the way you were defining it was, you know, as I said, I consider myself a proponent of democracy, and democracy, I think, allows for significant political freedom. Now, I think you disagree with me on that, and that's fine. We've kind of had that conversation before, and we'll probably have it again. But I think, you know, a lot of the... I don't think democracy is authoritarian. And if democracy is authoritarian, then again, that goes back to my point that, well, then the concept really really isn't useful to me. Yeah.
So I think what you just said kind of falls into what I was going to respond to you with, and it's, as you cite these historical events that were, you know, as we move from kings and other kinds of rulers, monarchy to democracy, I would say that as that imagined scale that I listed before, where it was the 0 to 100, I would say, yeah, like if you're a democracy, well, actually, oof, I found myself in a bind here. I could cede the rules of the game to you, and then I could say a democracy is moving on the scale down towards the inevitable like 0 that I like. So you moving from monarchy to democracy is maybe a move from like 75 to 40. So it's like we have now made it more just because at least it's the people who are the rulers and it's not this cabal of elites. But I'm reluctant to see that because I still feel like I'm being ruled over by other people and my voice is minuscule. So it doesn't really, I feel like democracy almost gives cover to using the monopoly on violence on people. Because since we imply that since you can vote, that makes it okay because everybody, the majority can make a decision and it's the people. But I feel like that gives cover to still forcing things on people that don't want it. And although I guess that's better than one king doing it, it's almost scarier to me because you've given people an out, right? You've been like, well, the people decided it. It's not one person being, crazy. It's a lot of people agree on this. So it's like you're being more reasonable about forcing things on people, but that almost makes it worse because if it was clearly unreasonable, then we could all agree it's unjust. Now, I still think it's unjust, but now a host of people have been convinced that it's fine. And I think it's still very morally wrong because you're still pushing people into situations that they wouldn't consent to. So yeah, no. Back to what you said at the beginning about how blurry are we? Because that I'm an anarchist, yet I pay taxes, and taxes are used to fund people who. I don't even need to talk about them killing people in wars. We can just talk about them arresting people for nonviolent crimes or something more closer to home. There's a very high likely. There's a chance that my money has paid into that system and those things. I think that's a moral failing on my part. And I think if I pretend like that's not a moral failing on my part, that's bad. And if I should recognize that as I've contributed to this very bad system, and if I say, well, that's fine because I had to, then I'm just giving up on it, right? I recognize that's a bad thing that I would like to change, and I wish it wouldn't be the case. And I recognize that as a moral system I'm playing into. So I'm willing to accept that I've done something wrong by being a coward. And I've pretty much bent down and said, well, the state would hurt me if I don't give them money, so I'll let this gang shake me down, and they're going to use that money to do violence on other people. I pretty much think that that's a bad thing on my end. And if I was working towards the good, it would be the ideal that I proposed earlier, which is like, which would be to not pay into the system that hurts people and to not consent to that system and to only engage in voluntary actions. So I guess I don't think I'm contradicting myself to say that, because if I admit that it's clearly a bad thing and that's how I truly feel, then I think that's squared. I would like to avoid taxes at all costs. I was actually kind of upset at myself because when I went to the grocery store the other day, I didn't get cash back. And if I get cash back, then when I go to get my haircut or when I go to a very small corner store that I frequent regularly, I'm under the impression that if I pay them in cash, they might not even put it on the books. Therefore, it might not get taxed in the same way. And I want to contribute to them doing things that aren't monitored by the state because I don't want to fund the state in any capacity. So yeah, I'm very aware of that. It's something I actually talk to a couple of my friends about often. So yeah, I don't think I think I am doing something bad by paying into the system.
Just a few comments I'll make. Well, one, yeah, I guess then you and I agree at one level. I mean, I think to a certain extent, everyone involved in this system, to one extent or another, is morally culpable. Now, you and I aren't as morally culpable as George Bush and Barack Obama because you and I have never had the same amount of power that George Bush and Barack Obama have had. And then, second point, I think this also goes back to the way we disagree about the social contract. So I think if we live in a society, there's a certain... go ahead.
Okay, I think anything on the social contract we have to table because we're over an hour. We're at like hour 7, And I know if we talk about social contract, like I don't even think we've formally talked about it. We've implied it and danced around it. But I feel like if we're going to do that, I think we might have to. I think this might be a teaser for something to us talk about in the future, because I can't see us talking about it for like 6 minutes. I think we are going to get bogged down in stuff if we try to talk about that. And I know we've been talking for
but I mean, I think this is an important point to make.
Okay, you can make the point, but maybe I'll just refuse to respond for now, because I know then you're going to want to respond and we won't be satisfied with the short time. Okay, let's do that.
All right. Well, I just wanted to make the I just wanted to make the point that to live in a society, you have to you have to give up a certain amount of autonomy. I mean, there are things that we don't, in the society we live in. You can't steal, you can't murder, you can't do all these things, or you're gonna get you're gonna get those freedoms taken away. So I guess I don't agree with the idea that, well, democracy isn't fair because to be in a group of people, you have to cede a certain amount of your autonomy. And then my last thing I'll say is, well, then when your issue with democracy, I just wish, or I think you should use a different term than authoritarian. I mean, I think tyranny of the majority, if you have to say something, talk about, well, this democracy is someone else's intuitions or beliefs being forced on me. I just don't agree with your use of the word authoritarian, which is fine, but that's another distinction I think is important to make.
I think you had I think that's actually the correct reaction on the authoritarian part. I'm only responding to that. I'm not going to touch on the other stuff right now. That's just such a can of worms. And as you were saying this, I was like, yes, I'm very right to think this is a can of worms, and I will not address it. I think part of why I like calling that authoritarianism, and it feels so true to me, is because it has a negative connotation, but it's not like I'm accusing you of genocide. Right. I think if I was calling it like tyrannical or fascist, it would be a lot worse if I was like, I think those are much stronger words, tyranny and fascism in general. And tyranny of the majority is like almost cliche. And I feel like it gives democracy, as I was kind of saying before, too much credit for being of the majority, when I don't necessarily think that's necessarily. I guess what I'm saying is, you being upset by me calling it authoritarian is almost the perfect reaction I should want, because that evokes how negatively I think of state control in any capacity. Is I think even when it's, I guess, like the typically referred to as the best form of government, I still am like, yeah, but that's still authoritarian, and that's still disgusting. So I think the negative connotation I use encaptures the feelings I'm trying to evoke, and obviously you don't agree with those, which is why you're a proponent of democracy. So, but I don't know if there's a word that is a better fit there. I'll pass it back over to you, and maybe we should wrap this up. And we did get sidetracked on the debate, but we should see where we go from there.
I want to make one thing clear, which is I want the kind of democracy that I want would be stateless. Now, I'm not quite sure what how that would work out. I'm not a fortune teller. I can't predict the future. But I would want to live in a kind of democracy that eventually I think humanity should move to a point where it's very democratic, but without the state involved. So I guess that would be my distinction when you say, well, you're Democrats with small d, you're still using the state. I would say, well, no, I also want a stateless society just like you do, but I still see it to be important to have certain democratic elements within that stateless society.
Okay, I do think that's interesting. I think those might be two broad ideas to tackle in the future. Would be the concept of the social contract, and then maybe the idea of a stateless democracy and how that might work. I think those are two things we should consider. But on that note, we did well over an hour on the Gene Epstein and Richard Wolff debate, even though we did get somewhat off track. But I think we covered at least the spirit of their debate without really rehashing what they had to say. And I would recommend that people listen to it, because we kind of responded to that debate, but we didn't necessarily reiterate the points they made. So if people are interested in that, I think it's worth checking out. So so if you enjoyed this episode, do you want to mute yourself real quick?
I'm not able to. My computer's frozen.
Nice. Okay. I'm gonna pause for another second, and I'm just gonna sign off. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely check out our backlog. You can find us on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points, and then you can see the video version of it. Or you can just find us on any podcaster like Spotify, SoundCloud, or Apple Podcasts. And we'll be covering a lot more stuff like this in the future. So signing off, it's Matt and Matthew.
I just I can't stop it.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say. I'm like, is that the concern here? I think I can stop it on my end. Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I think if I stop it on my end, it will still go to your Dropbox and everything. So I'm gonna stop.
Okay.
it.